I'm Ralph Adolphs. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist from Caltech. I'm going to begin by thanking the organizers, Marco, Thomas, others for inviting me to speak here at Chapman University, for putting this on, all of you for being here. So far, I've attended maybe half or so of the talks, and I have to say I found them extremely interesting and fun. The venue is great. It's like a round table room. The discussions have been great. It's something that I'll comment on this briefly, that as a practicing neuroscientist with a big lab, I get to do not enough. Talk to people, especially people from other disciplines, because we're so busy just keeping our own labs running. As with many of the other talks, this will be fairly broad. I'll begin with some general comments along the lines that Thomas had sent me some months ago, just broad questions about how philosophy and science, in particular the science that I do, cognitive neuroscience and psychiatry and psychology, interact, and then get more concrete and go into three sort of case studies that are work from my own lab, which is work on personality, intelligence, and emotion. So as I go through them, I'll raise a bunch of issues that hopefully you'll find interesting and that will stimulate discussion and questions from you. I'm not getting any feedback from the Zoom, so I'm assuming people are able to see and hear me. And I know that I'm supposed to be tethered here so people can see me, which seems irrelevant as long as you can hear me. But so if you can't hear me or there's some problem, then obviously interrupt. Okay, great. Ivan, thank you for confirming. So, we had this discussion certainly towards the end of Uri's talk yesterday and probably on the first day, which I sadly missed. For questions like this, which subdiscipline of science can benefit the most from philosophy, if I want to sort of get a general sense, for lots of questions that people have written stuff about, I go to my friend ChatGPT. So this is GPT-4's answer to that question. It's exactly these disciplines listed here on the screen, which make a lot of sense. Physics is one that apparently has benefited a lot from philosophy for all these reasons, because quantum mechanics, relativity come up with things where you sit down and say, look, we need help from philosophers to make sense of this. But so do biology, neuroscience, AI, CS, psychiatry, you could probably put in here, psychology, all of the disciplines that are related to the work that I do: cognitive science, cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, various disciplines coming from different backgrounds and angles to the study of the mind. So I think I'm in a good discipline to benefit from philosophy. I'm hoping to benefit from the philosophers in this group here. So I got more precise than my discussion with ChatGPT, specifically how philosophy and cognitive science could contribute to one another, and it was very long. So these are just 2 points. But they're points that have been raised in our discussions, the points that Uri, for instance, yesterday had up on the screen, points that we've talked about and written about, and hence GPT, who's been trained on everything we've written, will regurgitate that to you. They're pretty obvious. All of us could come up with this conceptual advance, clarity, foundational concepts, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes both ways. So in the summary here, GPT says that philosophy provides theoretical framework, ethical guidance, conceptual clarity, and the science, on the other hand, offers the data and hence new questions for the philosophers. What I was missing in this, and what I missed, at least in the discussion yesterday, was an ingredient that I wanted to add to this. So I'm not going to belabor all of these because they're fairly obvious points, but there's an ingredient that I wanted to add because I think it's important to defend. And it took me a while to get to it. So I kept asking, okay, some scientists are skeptical. What do you say to those? And again, ChatGPT says all the reasonable things, be patient, it takes time, it's obvious, it's not always obvious, et cetera, et cetera. Still didn't get to the point that I wanted. I asked about specific examples for cognitive science. So cognitive science, cognitive psychology, AI for sure, cognitive neuroscience, has had lots of contributions, very obvious ones, from philosophy. You heard yesterday about free will. You heard yesterday about consciousness. Jerry Fodor has written about modularity of mind. There's lots of work on how we conceive of them, of minds in general and the minds of other people and animals, so-called theory of mind, et cetera, et cetera. So it's easy in this discipline to come up with concrete examples where philosophy and specific philosophers have made substantial contributions, but it still didn't get to what I wanted. So eventually I asked, okay, why should you do philosophy in the first place? And again, a long list, at the end of which finally I got to the point which I wanted to contribute here, which is, we tend to think, I think yesterday I had a brief discussion with Thomas to the effect of, what are we going to, at the end of this conference symposium, are we going to publish a book? Are we going to put out a paper? Are we going to say we've solved a problem? What are the deliverables? What are we actually, providing? And we can list a whole bunch of things of the sort that I just rehearsed with you. But in addition, I think we need to defend what's in red here, which is certainly for my own part, and I think I can speak for the members of my lab and lots of students, doing philosophy or being exposed to philosophy, interactions with philosophers, provides us scientists with something that we should also have, but often tend to neglect, which is just personal joy in discussing things with people, freedom to abstract and have conjectures that may sound silly, the creativity to generate new hypotheses that comes with that. So something along the lines of, well, it's just inherently part of human nature to ask these difficult questions, to discuss and debate them, and it's fun to do, and it motivates us to do the science. Maybe just one other comment on this. I hope the point is obvious, but it's often neglected and it's not made explicit because people feel silly saying it. But it came up concretely. I chair the Institutional Review Board at Caltech, which is a group of people that oversees the ethical approval for human subjects research. And there's lots of criteria we go through. One of the basic ones is a sort of risk-benefit analysis. So you have a study, there's some risks of administering a drug or doing some intervention, and there's a benefit. You're going to discover something that will cure depression or Alzheimer's disease. So we had people that are no longer on there, on the IRB, who said the following things. Caltech doesn't have a medical school, and many of the protocols we reviewed are very basic science. And so they said, well, we're going to just show some things on a screen. We're interested in how our theory of visual working memory might relate to this. And so these people in the IRB asked, so what's the benefit? They're not curing a disease. They're not producing an application. And in fact, the investigators, there's a box that they have to fill out. What's the benefit? They said, there's no benefit. We're just satisfying our curiosity. So for these people on the IRB, they said, well, the risks are small. People were shown pictures on the screen. The benefit is zero. Therefore, you can't do this. So I had to defend the value, and I defended what's here in red, saying, look, by that criterion, all of art, for example, would go out the window. They're not curing a disease, they're not providing a deliverable, but it's part of human nature. And so we should value the intrinsic value of doing philosophy, even when we're scientists. I think it's very obvious to everybody in this room, but I just wanted to emphasize this point because it seems to me often lost. And I think it's essential in general, or for everything in life, but it's particularly one place where I think philosophy can contribute to science by showing us that there's more to just curing diseases and providing deliverables that we have to run into our grants. There's room for just talking, discussing, wondering, without needing to provide a justification what the benefit of that would be. Okay, let me quickly go with respect to cognitive science through a couple of other again, fairly obvious, but now more concrete examples or ways in which cognitive science benefits from philosophy. One is very obvious, and you've all seen Venn diagrams of this sort, which is that cognitive any kind of cognitive science is inherently and essentially interdisciplinary. And you could add other disciplines here, maybe economics and so forth. But the point is that if you took one of these away, for instance, if you deleted neuroscience, it would be obvious to everybody that the field would suffer. If you deleted computer science, it would be obvious to everybody that the field would suffer. If you deleted philosophy, it should be obvious to everybody that the field would suffer. It's inherently interdisciplinary. And if you look at the history it's full of those kinds of interactions. As you probably know, psychology, which is sort of the center of the study of the mind, as a discipline, it was a subdiscipline of philosophy until about 1850, when Fechner and Wundt and other people in Germany came up with sort of mathematical psychology, psychophysics as its own discipline. But it's remained interdisciplinary since then. Another one, which is also very strongly present in cognitive science, is that it requires multiple levels of abstraction, essentially. There's many different ways of looking at this, but something that we show to our students for the introductory psychology, neuroscience courses at Caltech is this famous scheme from David Marr, which he posed with respect to vision, but you can pose it with respect to any other type of psychological process, which is that there is a range of abstraction. You have three. It's not just tripartite, it's probably a spectrum. But the idea is you can study how this works in the brain. Then you're a neuroscientist and you measure, neuronal activity, etc. You can be a computer scientist or a cognitive scientist of some type, in which case you're more interested in the kinds of computations and algorithms that are being implemented or realized in the brain. You might not care about the brain details, or you can be even more abstracted. If you're an engineer, you're sort of wondering, well, how would I design a synthetic system that would have vision? And coming up with these levels, thinking clearly about the relations between them. So multiple realizability is one feature. There's typically a one-to-many mapping as you go from the higher ones to the lower ones. And what the mapping should be like. Is it identity? Is it realization? Is it reduction? If you talk to a lot of people who are new to the field, they've heard those words, but they don't really know what they mean technically. And so again, this is something that philosophers of science in general have certainly written about a lot, and the impact has been very large on cognitive science. And then finally, this one, or not finally, but this one here as well, we've heard about a lot. Clarifying both the concepts and the relations between them is also essential everywhere in science, but in cognitive science, the start for all our concepts is folk psychology. The reason you can understand what psychologists say is because the words they use are continuous with the words that people have used for a long time, well before there was any science of psychology. And so using those words that we already have, emotion, personality, intelligence, the ones I'll be talking about, for example, and making them precise so that they can be used in a science requires input from philosophy about how to go about doing that, and how to go about doing that without having people say, well, you've just changed the topic. So here's one view that introduces some of the variables I'll be talking about. Actually, let me put both of these up. So I'm a neuroscientist. People have different views about the relation between mind and brain. You heard yesterday from Aaron Schurger that certainly if you think in terms of consciousness, it's a very debated topic, and maybe consciousness is something else, whatever that might mean. There's general agreement, and I find it obvious enough that I'm not going to argue for this at all here, that emotion, personality, intelligence are in the brain. So they're constituted by something going on in the brain. You don't know exactly what. It's probably less than all of the brain. It's complicated. And the weakest kind of relation that philosophers would put on this would be something like some kind of supervenience relationship. That is, you can't have a change in intelligence or personality without necessarily some change at the level of the brain, which is easy to come by because the brain's changing all the time. But so these are constitutive relationships. The causal ones are to behavior and other measures from which we might infer these psychological variables. So typically how it goes is I give you a self-report questionnaire, as might be the case for assessing your personality, or I give you a performance task and do a factor analysis, as might be the case for deriving general intelligence. And from those observed measures, I infer these unobserved latent psychological variables, your personality or intelligence. So again, the personality and intelligence, their relation to the brain is constitutive. The relation between those and the measured variables, the behavior, or in this case, an fMRI measure from the brain, those are causal. And eventually, what we would want is some explanation that takes us from the measures of the brain to a mechanism that explains how the behavior is produced. So I know this is like a very broad sketch, but it helps to anchor the basic view for the variables I'll be talking about in just a second. Last one here, just a couple of other quick examples. There are many concrete examples where philosophy has had a big impact on cognitive psychology, probably mostly cognitive psychology in the first instance. Neuroscience, for obvious reasons, came later. We didn't have the tools to measure stuff about the brain. But there's lots of work from card-carrying philosophers. Peter Gerdenfurt has done a lot of work on semantic conceptual spaces and how we can think in a geometric way about what concepts are, the things that we use to think about the world with. Neuroscientists have taken this, and you record from the brain, and you find patterns of brain activity when somebody is thinking about or perceiving an object and has a concept in their mind. And a very similar geometric framework is used in modern neuroscience to define representations from neural activity. Much the same happens in modern machine learning. It's the same thing. If you train a neural network to classify objects that are visually presented, one question is, how does it abstract those? How is it able to represent those? And how does that look? And again, a geometric interpretation is one that's usually used. This one I already alluded to earlier. The late Jerry Fodor, had a very influential thin book in 1983 or so about modularity that's had a huge impact in cognitive psychology and cognitive science. That again, I won't go into. Here's the very quick picture of it. His idea was you have information coming into the senses, vision, audition, etc. And then there are these dedicated modules that are specified or that are distinguished by particular criteria, from which he had a list and that are debated, informationally encapsulated, cognitively impenetrable, et cetera, that then feed into a central system for thinking about the world, belief, fixation, and so on. So again, without going into any of the details, it's easy to come up with concrete, card-carrying philosophers that put out books that have had a very large impact in psychology and neuroscience. I'm going to skip this one here. Okay. Let me go on to the three case studies here, these ones here, each of which raises, I think, really interesting points. The bottom line for all of these is these are valid, important, interesting domains of study. They're a complete mess if you look at the science. And one reason that they're a mess is because there's been insufficient input from philosophers to clear up lots of conflations, conceptual confusions, etc. So all of these can benefit. If you ask, is there a philosophy of personality or intelligence of emotion? Not really. So the impact from philosophy of mind or philosophy of psychology on these has been, should increase. There's a strong argument to be made that and I'll show you some examples of the problems and debates. I'm going to go through these very quickly. Again, just to give you a general sense of the issues. So personality has a fairly long history, but one of the most modern, one of the currently most accepted one is the so-called Big Five personality theory. It's conceived probably back in the 1950s or 60s, but it got most popular around 1980. And this is the one my lab uses. Most people use this. And you've probably heard about this: openness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, etc. And there's a lot of external validity to these. They correlate with lots of other measures. But how personality researchers came up with these is interesting. What they did was they looked at words in English that people use to describe other people. That's it. That's the data. The data are words that people use. And then they did a factor analysis on the words, on the similarity of the rated semantic meanings of the words, and derived these 5 factors. But it's based not, you might think, put a camera up and, measure behavior, right, about people, or do something biological. But the way that that modern personality theories, especially this one, came about is just through a lexical analysis of how people talk about personality. So you would think this would lend itself very well, for instance, to a large language model, presumably ChatGPT. If it didn't know anything else, I mean, obviously it knows this particular theory because it's out there. If you just asked it to come up with a theory of personality, it would probably come up with this theory because all it has are word tokens in its training. By contrast, here's an example of work in animals, by researchers in animals, mice, to look at personality. It's worth pointing out that in their paper, they don't use the word personality. Most people who work on anything psychological in animals don't use the word psychology or mind or any of those words, but try to get around it with other words. But this is what they're looking at. They had these animals move around for a long time, put a video camera up, and there's lots of, there's a nest and other animals and shelter to interact with. And you can, over days and weeks, you can annotate what these animals do. Some are hiding out in the shelter a lot. Some interact a lot with other animals. They have patterns of behavior that characterize the propensities of a particular mouse to do certain things reliably. Some really like other mice, some really like hanging out in the corners, some are exploratory, et cetera, et cetera. And what they then did is they came up with, they called them identity domains. They derived 4 here. These are personality factors. They're the same as for the human case. They're different, and they raise the question, if you use this kind of data-driven way, how interpretable are the results that you get? So they're different than the way that people talk about personality using words, which was the origin of the big 5 personality factors. But they are personality factors that they derived just from the behavior of the mice. It's worth noting that in this study and several others, they actually try to come up with essentially a mathematical equation that describes a metric for what is personality, which would seem like a good, yes.
It seems like the top 5% of your screen is always obstructed by some Zoom thing.
I know, but it's not on my laptop. It's there, and so somebody else would need, like Lisa maybe would have to click it.
Yeah.
I can't click it. Yeah, there's nothing for me to click on. Well, I'll tell you what the equation is, or what it doesn't work.
It's just a question of click here.
Yeah.
Oh,
No, it doesn't work because it's not on here.
can I try?
This may work. Okay. Different
Kind of
control.
tough one too, if you, does it drop down?
Yeah.
Professor.
The top one,
Yeah, if you open up the option, go to hide.
Make it go away with.
maybe I hit the wrong thing.
Somewhere.
Show video panel,
No, I think you can.
hide.
That's good, Lisa.
Maybe that's as good.
Yeah,
as you can do.
that's as good as you can do, yeah.
Okay, that's not true.
You have
Well, what the equation shows is something that upon reflection is pretty obvious, but if you read the literature on personality, if you read personality psychology, you will be absolutely bewildered. I certainly was. It's a mess. There are all kinds of theories out there, and they conflate everything. Here, these researchers in animals tried to come up with a metric that makes a lot of sense. So the metric is, it's very simple. It's you want to maximize the ratio of the between subject variance to the within subject variance. What does that mean? You want, for personality, you want me to be as different from you as possible. I have a particular personality that makes me the person I am and a different person from Thomas or anybody else. So you want to have large between subject variability in personality. We're all different in personality. But on the other hand, you want the within subject personality to be extremely small. I have exactly the same personality now and tomorrow and in a week from now, because it's a temporally stable trait that doesn't change over time. There's not much in adult people. So that's the basic intuition. It preserves identity of individuals in distinguishing them from one another, but keeping them constant over time. Anyway, so just one example of 2 very different approaches to the construct of personality with different results. And when we've published, we have published maybe 1 or 2 papers and been trying to publish papers on animal personality. It's extremely difficult because the reviewers are personality psychologists, and they have a very hard time understanding what I just told you. So 2 challenges from this. One is how to revise the folk psychological terms and the concepts associated with them. So one big problem for, certainly for the types of variables I'm talking about, personality, intelligence, emotion, is that there's this long historical entrenchment of how people have written about them in literature and thought about them, and before there was any science. And so trying to change those terms, you could just have totally new ones, but then the problem would be people wouldn't think you're talking about personality, intelligence, and emotion anymore. And I think we are, but we need to revise the terms for science. And the other big problem is all throughout these sciences is a failure to distinguish between constitutive and causal relationships. Let me just show you one hopefully somewhat entertaining example pertaining to the paper that's cited at the bottom here, which took about 3 years to publish, because we ran into reviewers that had the following views. So we wrote about personality, and the paper was about what is personality. So some people said it's everything. It's, you know, the genes, the environment, the brain, the behavior, etc. It seems that that's too broad, and we wouldn't generally ascribe some of these. We would, at least I think it's intuitive, to say the genes of the environment are antecedent causes that, in the right in developmental context, once you develop a person, lead to personality, but they're antecedent to that. But here are some of the reviewers' comments, each of whom was not a philosopher, but claimed in the review that they had philosophical training, by the way. So the first one says, the idea that personality must be instantiated in the brain is, I believe, uncontroversial. All psychological characteristics must be instantiated in the brain, and the section that we got in our paper on insights from neuroscience don't really tell us much about personality. So this reviewer's complaint was, well, it's obvious. These guys are saying personality is in the brain, and everybody already knows that, so the paper doesn't contribute anything. Reviewer 4, we had a lot of reviewers on this one, says the authors write that personality is constituted by features of the brain. That's a pretty radical view, in as much as almost nobody has ever defined personality in terms of anything other than observable behavior. So you see the problem. There are people coming in with very strong views. They're not, not predicated on any solid philosophical considerations, and they certainly conflate constitution and causality. In particular, it's easy for the second one, who says personality is just in the behavior. It's just patterns of behavior. That's it. I don't need to do an experiment. I can do a thought experiment that dispels that pretty quickly. If it's just in behavior, I take you, you have a particular personality. You're very extrovert or very neurotic. I paralyze you, maybe permanently. You have locked-in syndrome. The behavior is gone. Have I erased your personality? The strong intuition would be to say, no, what I've done to you is I've made it impossible for you to express your personality and behavior, but you're still an extrovert person. You're still a neurotic person. You can't show it to me. So again, the thought is what's constitutive should be stuff in the brain, and then there are causal relations denoted by all these other arrows here that are not constitutive of personality. And if you take that route, then you can come up with interesting architectures for how personality might then interact with other psychological variables, if it's indeed in the brain and in the mind. And the usual, or at least one to me intuitive idea, is that it's some kind of hierarchical relationship. So personality expresses itself in behavior only through emotion, motivation, and a bunch of other psychological variables. You could test this also. You could take a person who has frontal lobe lesions, whose personality has changed, and ask what else has changed. And you would find, well, their memory hasn't changed, their intelligence hasn't changed, their perception hasn't changed, their emotion has changed, their control has changed, lots of other. So you can come up with an architecture from neurological dissociations that would support this kind of view. Okay, let me move on to the next one. This will be very fast. We've worked on predicting intelligence, understanding intelligence from brain imaging data. And the basic idea is just coming back to this picture here. We have two sets of measured variables, the intelligence ones, behavior-based, and the brain imaging one, and we want to predict the behavior from the brain imaging one. And when we did this, one important finding was that a lot of the problems with that kind of approach is in the behavioral tasks rather than which is what we had initially assumed, the brain imaging data, which is very noisy. So this is Raven's progressive matrices. You've probably all seen these. This was available for all these. This was in 1,000 subjects who had brain imaging data and intelligence tests. And we were not able to predict very well their performance on this task. But the reason is that this task is very noisy. And when instead we used a factor analysis to derive what Spearman called G, the general intelligence factor, from performance across many different domains. So it's basically the intuition is, if you're intelligent, you're smart across many different tasks. You're good at arithmetic, your reaction time is good, you're smart in many different ways, and that's this general intelligence factor that I can abstract if I do hierarchical factor analysis. And that we were able to predict very well from the brain imaging data, leading us to think that indeed this is how intelligence should be conceptualized. Another quote from the paper that we battled with here, this time from the editor, and the reviewers had lots of problems as well. But the editor made the interesting point, I'll just quickly quote it, saying, "I'm even more confused than reviewer two and want to know what it means to try to find the neural basis of something that doesn't actually exist. A statistical construction, G, general intelligence. There's an ontological problem here, I think, that needs some discussion. General intelligence simply doesn't have the status of concepts like short-term memory, depth perception, and so on." So here's somebody actually saying what you're trying to study, the psychological variable, just doesn't exist. And we had to take actually I consulted with philosophers at Caltech in crafting the rebuttal to the letter to the editor and the reviewers to try to persuade them that in fact it does exist, and there's many other examples from science where we're inferring something from statistics or multiple measures, and that's a valuable variable, but like all psychological variables, it's latent rather than measured. Okay, so taking stock so far, a couple of issues with respect to, these are general issues, but they're particularly illustrative in the case of personality and intelligence. These are folk psychological concepts. We had words for them, with ways of thinking about them long before there was any science. And that is a problem. So they're historically entrenched in that way. We have to revise them. The other problem is that in many of these cases, for some reason, I mean, one could come up with speculations why, people are very confident in their folk psychological beliefs about these. So not for physics, I mean, maybe that's well for physics these days, at least these days, right? If somebody tells you, look, this lectern here is mostly empty space, and it's, there's lots of things that look different about the physical world than it appears to you, people don't have too much of a problem with that. But when it comes to your own mind, people tend to have very firm beliefs. Like, no, I know what these are because I have some kind of direct access to them, or whatever the argument is. And scientists are, regular people too that have the same problematic intuitions, with the result that even experts disagree on these terms a lot. And I'll show you the example in emotion in just a minute, where you could roughly say that there's no agreement amongst emotion researchers on what it is that they are studying, on how to think about emotion in that case. The concept need to be revised. Guidance from philosophy is essential. So turning to the last topic, emotion, which is most of what my lab works on. This also has a long and interesting history. All of these topics go back very far, but they weren't, the concepts didn't explicitly exist until relatively recently. For emotion, what's usually Charles Darwin is credited with sort of putting the scientific study of emotion on the map with this book in the late 1800s, which was around the time that empirical psychology in Germany, and then with William James and others in America, really started happening as a discipline distinct from philosophy's second half of the 1800s. So Darwin noted that in the case of humans, but also many other animals, we seem to reliably be able to infer emotions, which he did in his book. And so he noted both the homology and emotional expressions across the species, including humans, and he thought that there was some story to tell for why a submissive dog would make this particular posture, an aggressive or dominant dog would make this posture why the behaviors were as they were, that there was a functional adaptive story to tell about how these particular behaviors had come about. So, since then, as I mentioned, for most animals, people are very reluctant to ascribe any psychology, but certainly the ones that I've mentioned, and in particular, variables like emotion. We do that all the time. So if you have, a pet golden retriever, the argument that psychologists will often make is, well, this is a very potent signal to make you anthropomorphize, and you really want to attribute emotions and all kinds of things to the dog. Therefore, it's not scientific, and we can't talk about emotions in animals. We'll notice that that's not a valid argument. The fact that you make these, that you anthropomorphize, doesn't discredit what it is that you're attributing to the dog. And of course, the other upshot would be that, well, you do this with other people too. So you're anthropomorphizing there as well, in general. But it gets problematic if you have animals that have, very different behaviors. So philosophers have written about exactly this issue, certainly with respect to sentience, consciousness, etc. Like, for instance, Peter Godfrey Smith's book on the octopus, which is always a popular topic. Somebody on the chat here says there's incredible work on the dog's mind, and indeed there is. There's lots of people doing functional imaging on dogs. The dog genome has been sequenced, and as you know, there's all these different breeds of dogs. So dogs are actually great. I don't know what to call them. Great participants of psychological studies to gain insight into the mind of non-human animals. Still, for emotions, for sure, it's extremely debated how to think about that. I'll give you examples in a minute. So my colleague at Caltech, David Anderson, who is very reductionist and thinks that emotions exist not just in dogs, but in mice and even in flies, and myself teamed up and published this book a couple of years back, which you will notice on the cover, there's supposed to be a human and a dog. So we indeed try to use data from animals and try to make a strong claim that you can perfectly well study this if you think about it differently in animals. This is a slide from that book that David Anderson made. There's lots of things that are unclear and that you can question about this, but the basic picture, I'm going to just sketch it, is that, like everything, emotions evolved. And so if we look across animals, of course, again, it's important to point out these are all, since we're studying them now, these are all modern, currently living animals. So we didn't evolve from any of these. We evolved way back when from common ancestors that we need a time machine to get to. Nonetheless, you can have this kind of phylogenetic scale here that is supposed to map onto evolution in some rough way. And the idea is that emotions evolved by, as usual, layering on top more and more mechanisms here that correspond to adding particular features or operating characteristics, if you want, to emotions. And you can begin to list them. So for emotions to do what they evolved to do, to guide adaptive behavior, to take over your behavior, if there's some survival critical stimulus like a tiger or something in the vicinity, it needs to have these things that distinguish emotions from reflexes. So rather than just having a reflex that would make you run away from the tiger, emotions start building in scalability, so a change in intensity of the emotion. So you could be more or less afraid, more or less angry, and that would be exhibited not just in the qualities of the state and the corresponding brain activity, but in the behavior, often with qualitative difference. If you might freeze initially, then you might want to run away, then you might defend yourself, which is unlike reflexes. They are all or none. Emotions persist for some duration, often quite long, and that allows them to integrate lots and lots of information in order to guide behavior. Again, unlike reflexes, which are very short and phasic. They take over behavior, they coordinate many different kinds of responses, et cetera, et cetera. So you can come up with a list. You can look for these. These are generic across emotions, not for any specific emotion. But the idea is you can look for these in animal models, then in behaviors of animals, and then you can look for for them in the brain as well. But the basic idea, I think this is pretty obvious, is just like any other, or not like any other, but as in the example, for example, of thirst, which whether or not you want to call it an emotion is maybe more of a semantic issue. You can have lots of independent variables. You can deprive the animal of water, give it dry food, it could be hot, etc. And if it was just a bunch of reflexes, right, each of these would be very inefficiently linked to lots of different behaviors because that's how reflexes work. They're extremely rigid, narrow mappings from stimuli to behaviors. Instead, you have this intervening variable thirst. That's a state, that's a latent variable that can take all of these inputs and map it onto all of these outputs. And so that's the view with emotion states that David Anderson and I had in this book, and have still, that we want to study them as latent variables with particular properties. Okay, so the simplest picture, maybe this is pretty obvious, is something like this, that you have this central emotion state, and you can have many different effects. You can measure behavior, you can humans, you can measure verbal reports, you could measure changes in blood pressure, heart rate, changes in other cognitive processes that are affected by the emotion. It's essentially a functionalist view of emotion, that emotions would be individuated by their functional, that is, their causal relations to behavior and to other cognitive processes. It modulates attention, memory, decision-making, and so on. But this is turned on its head by many current psychologists. So here's an example. Many people subscribe to this. This is an example from Jim Russell that inverts. So this is the picture we had, completely inverts that. And here's a quote from him saying there's no need to postulate a mechanism that ties all these various components into one package. There's no latent variable, is what he says. Emotions are packages not because they stem from one mechanism, but because they're just selected by an observer based on a folk concept. So in a sense, he says, this is just an artifact of the concepts we have for emotions. And he and other people like Lisa Feldman Barrett literally say that emotions are just concepts. And if you don't have concepts, you can't have emotions, which seems to me to turn everything around on its head. So I've written about that in quite a bit, actually in some cases with philosophers like Daniel Andler, who's a card-carrying philosopher that Thomas, I think, introduced me to originally. Lots of papers, debates, trying to make distinctions that, again, emotion researchers tend to conflate. You tend to conflate the functional state, the emotion, the conscious experience of the emotion, and thinking about the emotion concept. And I think that the reason is what they do when they think about emotion, they don't read philosophy, they don't use data in the first instance, they just use their folk psychology. And they say, well, what's an emotion? Let me see. If I feel fear, if I have fear, I feel fear and I think about fear. So they're all the same thing. The emotion, the emotion, its conscious experience of thinking about it are one, right? And of course, that's a problem. So I've written a lot about distinguishing these, if for no other reason than a methodological one to make progress in terms of the science. Here's one person, Joe Ledoux, who's written quite a bit about it, that also makes a distinction, but draws a very different conclusion that is useful to think about. He's written a number of papers. This was his inaugural one in Neuron back in 2012, in which he argues, and he's argued since, you shouldn't use the word emotion scientifically, especially when you're studying animals. You should think about other terms, drives, motivations, what he calls survival mechanisms or survival circuits. And the reason that he gives is, well, because people confuse emotion with the conscious experience of emotion, with feelings. And we can't tell if animals have those, so we can't study emotion in animals. And it's not a good scientific approach. There's problems with that that are easiest to see by analogy to many other topics of study that are well regarded. Vision, right? If you're a vision scientist, you study vision in humans and animals, you study visual processing in the retina, in the brain. Most of those scientists don't take themselves to be studying the conscious experience of seeing. I mean, there are scientists working on the visual consciousness, but it's a separate domain. But if you talk to the person on the street and you say, I work on vision, they take you to mean that you're working on the conscious experience of seeing. That's what to them vision is. And so there we have no problem taking the layperson's concept of vision, which seems to include the conscious experience, and saying, well, as scientists, we've separated those and we're studying visual processing, and whether or not there's a conscious experience is a separate topic. Memory would be a good case in point. Again, if you tell the person on the street, I'm a scientist and I work on memory, they think you're studying the conscious experience of recollection. And there's a big literature now, as you no doubt know, making distinctions between types of memory that lead to conscious experiences, declarative memory, and lots of other types of memory that don't, priming and motor behaviors and so forth. So we should do the same thing with emotion, and that's what David Anderson and I, and also in my other papers, have argued for, but it requires people to make distinctions between a latent variable, a central state that we can analyze, we can measure, we can perfectly well study in robots and in octopuses and other animals. The conscious experience of emotion, which is of course an important topic and maybe very important in humans, but we don't need to commit ourselves to saying that if I use the word emotion, if I apply the word emotion to an animal, I'm thereby saying it has a conscious experience of the emotion, in the same way that we're not committing ourselves to attributing conscious experiences if we study vision or memory in these animals. So anyway, that's those are distinctions I've talked a lot to people about, and again, it's one clear example where emotion researchers would benefit a lot from making distinctions that come naturally to philosophers, but they seem to conflate them. There's lots of interesting hypotheses that would then follow. Once you make those distinctions, I think it would lead to fruitful hypotheses that you could test. One is that if you have an emotion that's always conscious, okay, well, you could test that. Are unconscious emotions not possible? You might say that if you have an emotion, you need to have the concept. You might think that this is the view that I would hold. If you have an emotion, in some animals, this results in the conscious experience of the emotion. And in some animals, probably only humans, this causes the concept. That is, you also think that you have the emotion because you've been made conscious of it. But those are all distinct stages of processing and need to be kept separate. I go to 2:30, yes, or so?
Yes, 10 minutes more.
Okay. Let me skip this one because it's pretty dense, as you saw, and come back to close with this here. So, I had this picture up before, and I mentioned that we need to revise the concepts that we have available for personality, intelligence, emotions. I give the example of, the big five here that people had, for humans, derived these personality factors from just an analysis of words. And I showed you briefly, it looks different, but still interpretable if you do it in animals in a data-driven way, just from putting a video camera up and looking at the behavior of the mice, etc. So how far can we take that, and what happens if you try to revise the concepts that we have, which in their origin, which derive from folk psychological concepts? Is there just a data-driven way of doing it? Well, there could be. The thought would be, if you have the brain data and you have the behavioral data, can we find some kind of relation between those that would give us these new kinds of variables? And so we teamed up with a philosopher, Friedrich Eberhard, who's at Caltech, who a few years ago came up, so he works on causality with people like Chris Hitchcock and others. And he came up with a method that tries to formalize what I just said with called causal feature learning. It's actually a really nice success story, I think. So Friedrich initially had the philosophical basis for this, and he formalized that. There's a couple of theorems that he's proved in papers. We then had two Caltech students, computer science graduates, who participated in a fellowship program at Caltech for 2 years. and actually coded this up, which is this link here. This is all Python code in GitHub to actually implement this basic idea in an algorithm. And we then applied it to actual data. Frederick's applied it to climate data, to astronomical data, and we've also applied it recently to neuroscience data. But the basic idea is if I stick an electrode in your brain, or I measure very detailed things about your brain, these are micro variables about the brain. And I have, on the other hand, if you will, micro variables, item-wise responses on questionnaires or tasks, right? Trial-wise performance. I have, for instance, for the Neo 5-factor personality inventory, there are 12 questions about each of the 5 factors, 60 questions in total. So I have 60 questions over here. I have fine-grained brain data over here. And what this algorithm does is aggregate these into larger variables with the constraint that we should maximize their causal relations. So that's the basic idea. Can we come up with new variables at a macroscopic level that are totally data-driven? It's an unsupervised algorithm whose constraint is just that it should form the strongest causal links between them. And so that's what we've done. There's a bioRxiv preprint here where we did this, taking about 1,000 patients who had lesions in different parts of their brain. And then there were lots of item-wise data on their behavior. And we tried to aggregate these to say, which regions of the brain have the strongest causal relationship to some factors about language. So it's one approach. It has lots of caveats and issues, but the basic idea is, are there data-driven approaches we can use to come up with completely new psychological variables, as causal feature learning tries to do? If it is successful and you get them, then of course the next question is, are they interpretable? Can you make sense of them? Are they useful? And that's a big open question. But I think it's a very exciting idea, and this type of approach is definitely something that not only in its origin, Frederick Eberhard, as I mentioned, is a philosopher, needs philosophers, but I think it also needs input from philosophers to guide how to do this and whether or not it makes sense and how to interpret what you get. Okay, let me finish here. So I started out by just giving you the list. There was discussion. You guys have had lots of discussion. There've been slides up, on this. You can come up with a good list by giving having a series of prompts, a conversation with ChatGPT for what it is that philosophy can contribute to science, especially cognitive science, and conversely. So there's a long list. I emphasized that one thing that's difficult to find unless you really probe, and that often doesn't come up, is we tend to justify the contributions of philosophy to science in terms of some clear deliverables. And of course there are such, but I think we should also value the social, personal aspects, which is just fun to do. And if it's fun to do, it will motivate those unfamiliar to doing it, like students, to do it, which is good. For cognitive science, you can come up with many case studies where card-carrying philosophers have contributed. It's harder, as I mentioned, to find specifically for personality, intelligence, and emotion. But there is philosophy of emotion. I've interacted with some people, like Bob Gordon, who has simulation views of how we can know about the emotions of other people, etc. And all of those interactions I've had have been extremely fruitful, and have co-authored papers with philosophers. So there's concrete examples. I think one big problem is that scientists tend to run things together and tend to not make distinctions that are really important, that philosophy would help to keep distinct, particular causal and constitutive relations. And then I mentioned that one big problem, certainly for cognitive science, is that it's still stuck in folk psychology. Again, the reason you can understand what psychologists say is because all of the words they use have been in usage long before there was a science of those words. And because of that, the concepts are messy, and scientists often can't agree. So you need revision. And one big challenge at the end, so like what I showed you with this causal feature learning, that approach is sort of very analytic. And it makes sense, this way to make progress in science. If you want to bracket the conscious experience of emotion from emotion, then you can study emotion in animals. You can look at mechanisms without worrying about the hard problem of consciousness. So those are all good, but I think we do need a counter actually from philosophy to say, well, but maybe you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and there are normative and ethical issues that may be left out, which I think is probably one of the motivations for which Joe Ledoux wrote what he wrote. The basic idea is, if I have a model of emotion that separates it from the conscious experience of emotion, and I study emotion in animals, I come up with all these mechanisms and circuits. I can have a mouse model that tests for antidepressants, for example. Lo and behold, I find a drug, it's an antidepressant, it fixes the mouse behavior in depressed murine models of sadness or whatever it is. I give it to depressed humans, it works. Depressed people that were stuck in bed are now able to get out of bed, they have a lot of energy, they come to work. I ask them, does the drug work? And they say, no, it's terrible. I get out of bed in the morning and I'm really active and I come to work and I feel exactly as depressed as I felt before. That would be the worry, right? That in fact you've ignored what it is that you were originally interested in, which is the conscious experience. So there is that aspect still to come back to. Okay, I'm going to end there. Thank you.
So we have 15 minutes. So I see first the person of the van.
Hi, thanks, it's fascinating. I'm a philosophy of science, but I started being interested in personality psychology and got sidetracked. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on a kind of worry that you might have already encountered from like social psychologists and cultural psychologists. So you're talking about this sort of data-driven approach that sort of studies brain data and behavior data and sort of hidden variables, component analysis and all that. And earlier at one point you presented a graph about how like is personality in the brain or is personality in the behavior? But this seems to me to be like ruling out the personality is in the environment, that kind of answer. So I guess I don't know to what extent that should be a worry. So for example, different cultures will have different categorizations of emotions so that they don't always recognize the same emotions, and there are also like some data, I don't know how much they are about cross-cultural differences in personality sort of carving up and stuff like that. And so I guess the worry isn't so much about like what if that's true, but the worry is about, whether the method you're proposing is able to tell if that were true and this were false, or was it sort of a question begging in a way where you set it up so that the personality either doesn't exist or has to exist in the brain? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. And it's certainly the case that, social and clinical, as you know, social and clinical psychology are often a separate department from cognitive psychology at many universities, in part because of the kind of reaction that we just voiced. They have sort of very different approaches, but I think they're not incommensurate at all. I mean, the quick answer would be, maybe I can put the slide up again, although it's probably too far down. But, if you have all of these different types of variables here in the boxes, again, the question you can define personality however you want. You need to do that clearly, and then you need to, tell me how would you test this. So if you're saying everything inside the circle constitutes personality, and changing the environment would therefore change the personality, okay, I mean, I put you in a different environment. Has your personality changed? And presumably the answer would be no, not instantaneously. It might change, especially if you're young, given enough time, because the environment has a causal relation to where the personality is, that's your brain. And so, I think you can come up, it's not hard, once you have a clear scheme like this in mind, to come up with tests that might show one or the other things to be true. But I think the scheme, that I sketched, so saying that personality is in the brain, that approach is perfectly compatible with saying it depends on context, it depends on the culture, it depends on the language. The reason it depends on those, rather than is constituted by those, is because those have causal influences. And you could add, society and language and other things in here. Now, you could take a harder tack, right? So you could say literally, if I'm thinking, so I'm bilingual, I can think in German and in English. If I think in German, does my personality change? If it did, then you would say, well, personality depends on how you think about it. And it's maybe constituted in part by the concepts that we have and the words, etc. So my quick answer to your question, though, would be the approach that I sketched here for dissecting these components, and in particular clarifying what's causal, what's constitutive, would very well accommodate any social, cultural approaches and acknowledge individual differences and cultural effects. You would just have to figure out where to put them. Do you put them inside or outside the circle? And then try to come up with tests for them. Does it help?
So Eric now.
Thank you. Thank you for being such a philosophy booster. That was really thoroughly
I love philosophy.
enjoyable experience just for that alone. I wanna your suggestion about the confusion in the emotion literature is the hypothesis that people are secretly importing folk concepts into it. I think that's very plausible. I actually wrote a long book on sympathy for history. That's definitely true, but I think something else may be going on as well. And it actually picks up on Alan's question to Rob Knight at the end, where the answer also revealed something about what's sometimes hard to get across to empirical scientists. And that is some concepts, and I think that some entities that have concepts attached to them, like emotions, might also have other evaluative concepts built into them. And I think emotions are plausibly like that. Philosophers call that thick evaluative concepts. And I think one way to think of this in behavioristic terms, or more empirical terms, is it's plausible that emotions have the expectations of how others react to us built into them. And those are going to be rather that's going to involve ethics and norms and other things. And so for you to want to have a legislative committee to say, well, actually, emotions are really X, and this is the list. That's going to be hard to stabilize if these other things actually enter into the nature of an emotion. So I think I've had referee reports like you too, where I think you're importing the folk concepts, but I think there's something else going on there as well. That because some of these entities are normative or laden in some ways, and it's much harder to stabilize those by fiat.
Yes, I should maybe I didn't say it well here. I definitely don't want to specify anything by fiat.
No, by empirical.
And I'm not. We were careful actually in our book. Certainly not to use the word definition. I don't know what that would mean, but not even to say we don't have a theory of it. We're not putting forth a theory of emotion. We're putting forward an approach or a framework that's preliminary for how to go about investigating emotions. And so that's the kind of spirit that, let's make these distinctions. Let's put up some walls and clarify things and bracket conscious experience concepts, lots of other things, so that we can study emotion, for example, in animals, and see how far we get. But then I'm totally with you. Once you have that, so if I have, a full detailed mechanism in the nervous systems of mammals for how emotions work, am I done? No, there's a lot more work to be done. And I think you would then start adding some of the things that you mentioned, which may be disproportionate or even unique in humans. I don't know if a mouse would have that. But you're right, emotion regulation, the intersubjectivity of emotions, cultural differences that we heard about. The question is, okay, how do we start bringing those in? And they're not, certainly if you're studying emotion in flies, which David Anderson does, they're not really there, those things. If you're interested in emotion in humans, and if you're interested in psychopathology of emotions, those are super important. And so they do make a difference. So it's really just a question of If you're a neuroscientist, if you're studying animals, where would you begin? If you're not, if you're a social psychologist, I'm not telling you just to stop doing social psychology and do that. No, it's a different discipline. So I think, we need to just keep separate what our respective domains are. The problem is if you put it all together and you say, well, there's one way, which is typically what people have done, and it requires acknowledging culture, it requires concept, it requires conscious experience, because then I really cannot study it in animals, and neuroscience approaches are difficult. So really my approach comes from a particular methodological approach, which is the desire to be able to study emotions broadly in non-human animals, ideally in artificial systems, to look at the detailed mechanisms that neuroscience might study. But that's different from what cultural or social psychologists might study, and those are still perfectly respectable fields.
So Thomas.
Yeah, one short question about emotions. It seems to me that there's a very good point in saying that what Ledoux says, which is that because the concept is loaded, let's drop the concept of emotions because people will think about conscious emotions. And you're saying, let's keep it. And I can see the truth. It seems to be that you're saying the same thing and that you're just saying the same thing in different ways. So is that true? And second, what would be the benefit of your approach, which is to say, do not confuse emotions and conscious emotions. I'm not sure I see the benefit of doing this. I see much better the eliminativist approach, which is to say, let's use a different word because otherwise we'll keep going into this.
Okay. Yeah. So you're right that I basically agree with Joe Ledoux that we should separate emotions and conscious experience, but I don't draw the conclusion that therefore we need to use a different word for one. Several reasons. One would be we don't do that in the case of vision, memory, the other examples that I gave. What word would you use? Whatever word you would use, you would look at what I'm doing and you say, well, you're actually studying emotion. I am studying emotion. I'm just studying it in a way that's more restrictive. Maybe one should divide it up as people have done for memory. And say there's declarative memory, there's non-declarative memory, there's a whole bunch. There are different mechanisms. Some are what it is that you're conscious of when you remember things, some not. And maybe we should do the same thing for emotion. And we kind of do that. We talk about the emotion state versus the emotion experience versus the emotion concept. So I don't want to throw it out because I think it is a part of emotion. Now, what you want to call emotion, at the end of the day, it's a semantic, cultural and lexical question.
Yeah, but what is not is to decide between a strategy where we decide to eliminate, another where we decide to make distinctions, and the third where we decide to keep it without making those distinctions because it says something which is too important that so we don't want to drop it. So these are three strategies that I can see, and I'm not entirely sure that. Yeah, I think it would be very important to clarify which one is the best.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, it's almost a social question about how, eventually, if we go with my research program or we go with Joe Ledoux's, what would work best for the science and for the way that the science could interface with the rest of society. Joe Ledoux would say, what I'm studying, it's fine, but you need to use terms like motivation and drive and so forth. And emotion, you should reserve only for the conscious experience. He has a particular theory about where that sort of a higher order theory of consciousness, basically, from where that might be in the brain. You could do that. It just seems to me, it would seem to me more difficult because actually, if you start doing that and you look at emotion states, as David Anderson and I and others are thinking about them, they're not just motivations and drives. They have a lot of other features. And I think you would need to come up with a different word. It would be very awkward. And at the end of the day, if all you're adding to that is now the conscious experience accompanying that, it seems easier to me to say you have the emotion and then you have the conscious experience. And by the way, the distinction is just conceptual. So I'm not saying that emotions are unconscious and then you have the conscious. They might be necessarily conscious, but that's should be an empirical fact rather than built into the concept to begin with.
Yeah.
Okay, there is a last question.
So there were 3 neuroscience talks so far, or philosophy and its relation to neuroscience. You were mentioning how some concepts related to, for instance, emotion, the neuroscientists were not making proper distinctions that they should be made. I gave some examples of actually neuroscientists using different words, thinking that they're the same thing and they're not. And Aaron was making perhaps the opposite point, saying that sometimes philosophical distinctions don't map to perhaps anything in the brain. So that might lead us into blind alleys and so on. So I mean, that's, I guess, the comment. The question is, do you have any thoughts then about what and how do we decide what we should try and what not?
Yeah, it's very easy.
Yeah.
Talk to one another and have a beer and hang out together. Do more of what we're doing here. That's it. Talk.
There was also a question on Zoom. I don't know whether you can.
There are.
But
You want me
maybe
to take a
you
look at
just
any of them, or
answered
do we need
it.
to get to the next
I think we have 2 minutes.
Okay, well, let's see if I can.
If you go and check.
At least there was one bingo.
Yeah, and she's asked the question which is similar to what you just commented.
Let's see over the-
Yeah, that's my question, but it's more like as I said, like a more of a meta philosophical question. So I suppose we can talk tomorrow when I'm there. There's no problem if we don't have time now. Thank you.
Okay, well, anybody on Zoom, I don't have time to go through all the chats, but has a very fast question? It's not. Okay.
Okay, so let's thank again.